Anyone who has ever watched the evening news or opened up a newspaper has seen a weather report. But few people know that 260 years ago, the London Times published the first ever forecast, a term coined by its creator, Vice Admiral Robert FitzRoy. His obsession with saving the lives of sailors, passengers and fishermen drove him to develop new instruments, gather data from across the whole of the United Kingdom, and use it to prognosticate the weather in a system that is still in use today all around the world. Such accomplishments alone would make him a giant of his age and a household name. But what if, on top of this, he had the distinction of surveying and mapping huge swathes of the coastline of South America, or later, as governor of the young nation of New Zealand, being the controversial champion of the rights of indigenous Maori? Or more profoundly still, being the captain of the ship and the man who invited a young and inexperienced Charles Darwin to join him on a 5-year odyssey that would forever change the face of science and give rise to his theory of natural selection, which, as a progressive, though devout Christian, FitzRoy would forever after regret. Join us as we explore the life of an extraordinary, though very troubled genius, who rose to every extreme challenge life threw at him, pouring his energy and entire personal fortune into projects that continue to save the lives and livelihoods of countless people, only to have endured long years of undeserved ridicule, destitution, and a deep state of depression that eventually ended his life. Our story begins in 1805, among the ducal palaces and regal mansions of the aristocratic FitzRoy family. Robert FitzRoy could trace his lineage directly back to the philandering King Charles II. However, though the wider family was wealthy, he was born the third son of a second son, so that he was personally unlikely to inherit any significant titles or estates. Boys in such positions would have received a prestigious education, but then as adults would have had to seek their fame and fortune in the military or in public service, as indeed his father, Lord Charles FitzRoy, had done, first as a Major General in the Army and then later as a Member of Parliament. This meant that the infant Robert rarely ever saw his father, who was either away on campaign or alternatively on the campaign trail. His mother died when he was only 5, such that he was raised by servants in a cold and loveless home, the sprawling mansion only making him all the more lonely. His only real hero was his uncle, Lord Castlereagh, the dashing and brilliant British diplomat who held together the coalition that finally defeated Napoleon, and to whom FitzRoy was frequently compared in both likeness and character. At the age of 12, FitzRoy decided to join the Navy, against his father's wishes, who thought a naval career was far less prestigious than one in the army. But in the end he relented, and Robert enrolled in the Royal Naval Academy in Portsmouth. He served as a midshipman on a number of frigates on extended oceanic voyages, earning solid praise and promotion from his seniors. At the age of 17, tragedy struck when he learned of the suicide of his favourite uncle, who had become quite unpopular as a hardline politician, resulting in severe bouts of depression and exhaustion, eventually leading him to slash his own throat with a razor. The shock of his suicide was to overshadow FitzRoy's entire life, as he also frequently himself suffered bouts of the black dog, and often worried that the condition, which we would now diagnose as bipolar disease, was genetic and would lead him to the same fate as his uncle. Nevertheless, by the age of 19, having served with distinction, FitzRoy graduated Naval College as a lieutenant with full numbers. In other words, a final examination score of 100%, the first candidate in British naval history ever to have achieved a perfect score. He was soon promoted to flag lieutenant, serving in the Brazilian outpost of the Royal Navy, where they provided support, officers and training to the fledgling Brazilian Navy, which was itself then fighting a war of independence from Portugal. Other interests of the Royal Navy in the region at the time included an ongoing hydrographic survey of the southern reaches of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, which at the time was being headed by Captain Pringle Stokes. After 2 years of danger, bleak weather, storms, blizzards, and extreme isolation, and the job still only half finished, Captain Stokes himself fell into a severe depression until he eventually shot himself in the head. His battered ship, HMS Beagle, limped into Montevideo harbour for repairs and further orders. In December of 1828, at the age of just 23, FitzRoy was put in command of the Beagle and charged with finishing the work of surveying the wild coast of South America, which, as a young captain, he did with great skill and confidence, on a number of occasions astonishing his crew with the way he commandeered the ship during hellish storms, and pulling them miraculously through incredible swells unscathed. During a notable episode when surveying on shore one day, several Fuegan natives had stolen a vital rowboat and made away with it. FitzRoy and his crew gave chase, but lost them in the myriad of small creeks and inlets they inhabited. They nevertheless came across their village and captured a number of their relatives, among them a man and a young girl, who were to be held as hostages until the return of the vessel. With no progress being made in the return of the boat, and the ship needing to move on, inclement weather prevented their returning the hostages safely, so FitzRoy decided to hang on to them for a while longer, eventually coming up with the idea of teaching them all English, and training them in the use of tools and building. In his own words, FitzRoy wanted them to become useful as interpreters and be the means of establishing a friendly disposition towards Englishmen on the part of their countrymen. Despite some later historians, perhaps not unfairly, accusing him of abduction, he took great concern for their welfare, being fed before any of the crew or officers, eventually returning with the ship to London in 1830. The indigenous Fuegans, now quite competent English speakers with a grasp of English manners and customs, became instant celebrities and were even presented to the King and Queen in a hope it would motivate their interest in setting up a diplomatic mission in Tierra del Fuego. FitzRoy spent a considerable sum of his own money in their upkeep and training, paying for tutors from a local missionary society and sparing no expense in their education. Unlike other explorers of the time who would abduct natives and bring them to London as circus freaks or scientific curiosities, FitzRoy forbade their exploitation, fully intending to return them to their homeland, where he believed they could apply their new skills and knowledge to pass on everything they had learned to improve the condition of their own people. In contrast to many Europeans of the time, FitzRoy believed there was no difference between so-called savages and themselves. His fundamentalist Christian belief that all men were created in God's image made him an ardent believer in the earnest, though misguided belief in the potential of missionary activity as a way to help indigenous people progress towards the benefits of civilization. By early 1831, FitzRoy began making plans for the return of the Fuegans back to their homeland, hoping, with their help, to establish a missionary outpost and supply depot for the Navy. His initial application to the Admiralty for a project which might accommodate them came to nothing, and so he chartered a small ship, again with his own money, and made plans to take them back independently. But he soon discovered, to his horror, that one of the Fuegan men had been sleeping with the girl, who was still a substantial minor. Things needed to move quickly before the scandal of a possible child pregnancy overshadowed all of their positive indigenous PR work in London. FitzRoy's aristocratic contacts turned up the pressure, and a new naval survey voyage was soon conceived of, to review incomplete Patagonian hydrographic charts, and to test a new range of chronometers that would more accurately confirm the longitude of key ports in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The journey was expected to take 2 to 3 years in total, circumnavigating the globe, and would provide an opportunity to repatriate the Fuegans along with a team of missionaries who would establish an outpost. His experience in the treacherous Antarctic Ocean, along with the suicide of previous skipper Stokes and FitzRoy's own familial predisposition for depression, made him highly conscious of the loneliness and psychological toll such a long voyage might take on him. It was unacceptable for a captain to fraternise with the crew, and there would be insufficient senior officers of aristocratic background aboard the vessel to dine with on a regular basis, or free enough from duties to keep him company. Depending on the assignment, it was customary for a captain to invite a small number of independent supernumerary passengers who would contribute to the collective value of the voyage and be free to accompany the captain when at table. Ideally, these would need to be of the appropriate social class, otherwise a voyage may become rather more tedious than dining alone. In this case, Captain FitzRoy hired a mathematician, a specialist surveyor, an artist, and a specialist engineer to service and maintain the 22 chronometers the Admiralty had entrusted him with for the task of longitude calibration. Some decades prior, the ultra-wealthy aristocrat and self-taught botanist Sir Joseph Banks put up a small fortune to accompany Captain James Cook on his first famous voyage to the Pacific, and came home an absolute sensation with 35,000 specimens that made him the preeminent naturalist of his age. Banks had the particular honour of being the first European to describe, name and catalogue thousands of never-before-seen plants and animals. His achievements set off a frenzy of nature study, with every educated gentleman in Europe dreaming of making similar discoveries that would cement their name in history as a scientist of repute and gain the membership of the prestigious Royal Society. Now, to be worthy of being called a scientist at the time necessarily meant you were a gentleman of sufficient financial means and liberty to study the wonders of nature purely for its own pleasure. To receive pay was to make one no better than a tradesman, which would be abhorrent and unworthy of a true man of science. For those interested in astronomy, mathematics, anatomy, physics, or chemistry, it was easy enough to do in the comfort of their own city, often within their own homes. But for those who were interested in geology, botany, and zoology, collectively called the study of natural history, it was necessary to go on field trips. Most gentlemen satisfied themselves with short trips to the seaside, with mountain hikes or countryside walks, but the really juicy stuff, as Banks had shown, lay in the great unknown wilderness beyond Europe. The problem was that seafaring expeditions such as Cook's, though exotic and rewarded with adventure and lusty Tahitian maidens, were often so long, so cramped, and so miserable that few gentlemen ever mustered the courage to sail outside of Europe. The Navy's solution was to typically appoint the ship's surgeon as acting naturalist on board, and provide suitable training in the gathering, preserving, and logging of specimens, all of which would be the exclusive property of the Crown, and upon the ship's return they would be handed over to a public museum to be studied and curated. FitzRoy had asked his long-time Navy mentor and family friend, Admiral Sir Francis Beaufort, to assist him in picking appropriate candidates for the voyage, considering the length and nature of the journey. Beaufort recommended Dr. Robert McCormick, a well-qualified and experienced surgeon with a special interest, training, and first-hand experience as a naturalist, which, along with his extensive Arctic expedition experience, made him the perfect choice to be commissioned in the dual role as ship's surgeon and naturalist. However, the surgeon would likely be frequently occupied attending to medical matters, so Beaufort was asked to find a suitable gentleman companion for the voyage. Such a companion should share his scientific tastes, make good use of the expedition's opportunities for researching natural history, dine with him as an equal, and provide a semblance of normal human friendship. FitzRoy's primary emphasis, then, was to invite an independent gentleman who would serve the primary function of social companion. He further stipulated that it should be someone who also had a background in natural history, despite already having hired his ship's surgeon for that role. This reflected a particular objective FitzRoy had in studying the geology of South America. The reason for this is that both Beaufort and eminent geologist Professor Charles Lyell had asked him to take specimens of rocks and to detail their formations to assess Lyell's proposition of the slow transformation of the Earth's crust over time. Lyell had just come up with a revolutionary and controversial new theory that suggested that the Earth might be substantially older than was believed at the time, and that mountains may have once been low-lying, even marine areas, that had been pushed up violently by internal Earth forces, similar to that of volcanoes, and he was looking for evidence in support of his theory. FitzRoy, despite being a conservative Christian, uncharacteristically went against the inference in the Bible for a young Earth, and in his discussions with Lyell, as well as in his own many detailed observations as a hydrographer, came to view the theory of the Earth's slow transformation over time as having substantial merit. Dr. McCormick had only basic training in geology, and as ship's surgeon, he would not be at liberty to spend great lengths of time away from the ship, so FitzRoy wanted someone who could venture out on shore and more extensively investigate the environment. Admiral Beaufort, as a senior member of the Royal Society, and having many contacts at Cambridge University, spread the word, and offered the position to a number of well-known scientists, including Professor John Stevens Henslow and George Peacock, who, though excited at the prospect, declined due to the length of the voyage and the objection of their wives. A number of other candidates similarly declined, until Henslow wrote to Beaufort suggesting a young assistant of his might be a good candidate. When 22-year-old Charles Darwin walked up the gangway of the Beagle to embark on the epic voyage that was to cement his future as one of the most celebrated scientists of all time, few would have predicted he would amount to anything of the sort. Charles Darwin was a daydreamer, slacker, and constant source of frustration to his eminent physician father, who had wanted him to pursue a career in medicine, enrolling him at the University of Edinburgh, arguably the best medical faculty in the world at the time. But young Darwin found lectures tedious and surgery class distressing, so he neglected his studies to the point of almost being expelled. His father, exasperated and having lowered all his expectations, now enrolled him into a theological college to hopefully qualify as a country parson, the easiest and cushiest career a gentleman could possibly score. Darwin had made a few friends during his skylarking university days and was particularly drawn to outdoor activities that included assisting in the field studies of marine zoologist Professor Robert Grant, as well as the renowned biologist and geologist John S. Henslow, who was to become a professor at Cambridge University. Darwin had just graduated as a novice priest and was apparently not looking forward to the prospect of a quiet country parish life, taking confessions and giving sermons, and despite not being particularly keen on geology, was desperately keen on taking the long trip abroad to escape England and the dull future that was in store for him. Henslow wrote to Darwin, "Captain F wants a man, I understand, more as a companion than a mere collector, and would not take anyone, however good a naturalist, who was not recommended to him likewise as a gentleman." He reassured Darwin to not worry about his lack of experience or ability as a naturalist, being sure, as a fellow Anglican priest, that the opportunity and experience would do him the world of good. He then wrote to FitzRoy advising that he had found him an ideal candidate. However, Darwin's unimpressed father torpedoed the idea as soon as he found out, Darwin then writing to Henslow to advise him he couldn't go. It was then that Darwin's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, heir of the immense porcelain empire, hearing of Charles' disappointment, pressured Darwin Sr. to change his mind, only for them to find out that FitzRoy had already settled on another candidate. Darwin made his way to London anyway and stopped in to see FitzRoy to pay his respects, and learned that FitzRoy had just received a message that the other taker had to pull out at the last minute. The position once again being vacant, FitzRoy nevertheless had serious reservations that Darwin's Whig political affiliations would make for too many disagreements and incompatibility over such a long trip, FitzRoy having himself just run an unsuccessful campaign for Parliament as a Tory candidate. But he nevertheless invited Darwin to dinner, and the two of them got on so well that FitzRoy, himself only 26 years old, yet taciturn, highly experienced and a respected mariner and intellectual, offered the wet-behind-the-ears Darwin the position straight up, despite their contrasting personalities. Anticipating the gruelling nature of the voyage, FitzRoy now poured a substantial amount of his own money into refitting the Beagle to better serve the needs of the task, including extra decks, cabins and storage. He and Darwin travelled around London shopping for supplies and getting to know one another better. Having only been an occasional field assistant up to this point, with few drawing skills and absolutely no knowledge of collecting and preserving larger specimens, Darwin urgently contacted his old professors as well as other experts who gave him a crash course in the ensuing weeks. He also needed to brush up on his geology, as this was to be his primary responsibility, to be left on shore exploring for weeks at a time on his own while the ship made its way along the coast engaged in survey work. To help him out, FitzRoy had a generous reference library installed on board and made Darwin a gift of Lyell's explosive new book, Principles of Geology, which Darwin found so inspirational that it was to profoundly model his thinking on whether parallel processes affecting living creatures might also slowly change them from one form to another over long lengths of time, just like the landscape seemed to be doing. By all accounts, the two of them got on surprisingly well, with very few disagreements of note over the course of what would become a 5-year voyage. FitzRoy would, despite his intense focus on charting, frequently accompany Darwin on field trips, taking long walks together and discussing geological curiosities and the peculiar wildlife, which Darwin would then later write up in his journals. These regular diversions were clearly therapeutic for FitzRoy, lessening the stress and depression he at times would find overwhelming. Their contrasting ideological backgrounds certainly gave them a lot to discuss, and even to debate, with Darwin writing to his sister and describing FitzRoy to her. "He is an extraordinary person. I never before came across a man whom I could fancy being a Napoleon or a Nelson." He then went on to describe him as scientific and everything that is delightful. Glowing terms for a man only a couple of years older than himself, but significantly wiser than his age would suggest. These convivial exchanges clearly had a substantial impact on Darwin's emerging ideas, as well as his articulation and defence of them against critics of similar social standing to FitzRoy. Ironically, despite their significantly divergent political and social backgrounds, for the most part and on most subjects, they seemed to see eye to eye. However, while FitzRoy readily accepted what we might call geological or tectonic evolution, unlike Darwin, he just couldn't abandon the existing doctrine of fixity of species of animals, created by God in their set form and going extinct when no longer serving their divine purpose. Ironically, These beliefs also supported his contention that humans were fundamentally all the same, with equal potential, while Darwin and his later protégés grappled with the implication that humans themselves, like animals and plants, could be less or more evolved. FitzRoy found this idea, along with its potential justification of slavery, unconscionable. Though he came from solid Tory, conservative, aristocratic roots, both his father and his uncle Castlereagh crossed the floor as MPs to support the abolitionist stance of Prime Minister William Pitt. Robert himself, often misrepresented in popular media, was, like his father and uncle, against the continuation of the transatlantic slave trade and expected it was just a matter of time before the institution of slavery was abolished in its entirety. During the ship's stopover in Brazil, they were confronted with it firsthand. FitzRoy was to record, "The immense extent and increase of the slave population is an evil long foreseen and now severely felt. Could the Brazilians emancipate the slaves now in their country and decidedly prevent the introduction of more, Brazil would commence a career of prosperity." Indeed, FitzRoy later purchased and fitted out a schooner in the Falkland Islands at his own expense, not, as has widely been reported, simply to aid in the survey work, but also to pursue slave vessels. He had anticipated that the Admiralty, which was already engaged in that activity in the Atlantic, would reimburse him for it, but was devastated when instead of support he received a rebuke and not 1 shilling for his expense. In a private remark written 40 years after the journey, at a time of mutual antagonism, Darwin related a story told to him where a Brazilian slave owner asked his slaves, in front of FitzRoy, if they would rather be free than remain his slaves. Their answer in the negative prompted Darwin to suggest that they were hardly in a position to answer truthfully, at which FitzRoy apparently lost his temper. This anecdote has been taken as FitzRoy's tacit support for slavery, but the lack of context in their exchange hardly supports the assertion. Moreover, FitzRoy's later action and writings in support of indigenous emancipation makes it untenable that he was anything but an abolitionist. As the trip continued, FitzRoy and Darwin regularly set off together on field trips, to the dismay of ship surgeon Dr. McCormick, who was generally tied up with medical duties and unable to join them. Darwin intentionally manipulated FitzRoy to sideline McCormick, whom he saw as a rival rather than colleague. He had a habit of privately writing condescending and petty comments about colleagues he disliked, whilst publicly praising them. Early in the voyage aboard the Beagle, he wrote to his sister, dismissing McCormick as an ass, despite the good doctor's highly qualified background and extensive experience, as well as Darwin's own lack thereof, because he saw McCormick as coming from a rival school and professor. It goes to his character and suggests that his numerous later criticisms of FitzRoy should be interpreted with caution, particularly once he himself became a celebrity. Now, on a Royal Navy vessel, specimens that were collected automatically became the property of the Crown, but occasionally officers and crew were allowed to keep their finds, as was the case on this journey. Darwin, as an independent passenger, had the right to keep all his own material, and as time went on, the officers and crew assisted him greatly and gave him much of their own collected material. As a hydrographer, FitzRoy was keenly observant of the uplifted Chilean coastline following an earthquake they had just experienced, and they took this as direct support for Lyell's theories. They later took some time to cross the Andes together, discussing how the phenomenon might account for fossils they found in strata high up in the mountains, or how weathered stones were too rounded by erosion to be the result of only a 40-day biblical flood. Again, FitzRoy showed that in many scientific considerations he was willing to ignore the conclusions of biblical scholars and side with the evidence. When Darwin was asked to write an account of the natural history discoveries of the voyage, which would form a part of the volume of the ship's narrative, His rare mention of FitzRoy's contribution to his thinking, the participation of other officers and crew, or their many contributions to his jealously guarded collection, upset FitzRoy deeply, who began to view Darwin as having a selfish agenda, something that would be profoundly offensive to a military man who was himself renowned for his generosity. It would be unsurprising if this contributed to a rise in the number of his well-known bouts of manic depression and outbursts of rage. And yet, FitzRoy would continue to wrestle with his mental demons on a daily basis. Darwin once wrote of him, "He is an extraordinary but noble character, unfortunately affected with strong peculiarities of temper. Of this, no man is more aware than himself, as he shows by his attempts to conquer them." Notwithstanding his debilitating episodes of mental illness, FitzRoy never once endangered the ships he commanded, with the illness only overwhelming him once safely at anchor. One time he thought he was losing his mind and wrote a letter of resignation, but his officers, 5 of whom would astonishingly go on to themselves become admirals, always stood by him and, like Darwin, held him in the highest regard. Despite his temper, FitzRoy was considered by all of his officers a mentor and teacher of the highest quality. The Beagle finally arrived home in 1836, 5 years after it set out. Darwin went back to his family and his new network of correspondents in the academic world, who ensured he would continue to refine his ideas based almost entirely on the pioneering work of Lyell, who became his longtime friend and mentor, though, like FitzRoy, would struggle to accept the implications of evolution. Darwin Sr. saw the profound and serious change in his son and recognized that he had finally found his true, though unfinancial, calling. So he abandoned the idea of installing him as a parish priest and continued to finance Charles' scientific research and writing for the rest of his life. As the implications of his emerging theory began to manifest, Darwin himself struggled with the social and personal ramifications it would have, and prevaricated publishing until a rival biologist, Alfred Russel Wallace, wrote to him, having independently come to the same ideas and was himself about to publish. The jealous Darwin panicked into action, publishing The Origin of Species 20 years after his epic voyage, just so as not to get beaten to the punch. Meanwhile, FitzRoy had come home to a hero's welcome. He had successfully repatriated the Fuegan natives, completed the cartographic surveys of South America, the Galapagos, and other unknown regions, established with absolute certainty the longitude of important ports of call around the globe, and had facilitated a series of extensive geological expeditions to collect samples for the gentlemen scientists back home. He began compiling a 4-volume set of books on the journey, which was published in 1839, and was widely acclaimed by the public, earning him a gold medal from the Royal Geographical Society. Strangely, no sooner had he disembarked than he married his long-time fiancée, Mary Henrietta O'Brien, to Darwin's great astonishment, as not once during the entire 5-year voyage had FitzRoy ever mentioned her to him. Clearly, FitzRoy was a man who kept his private life firmly to himself. It was only after he married his highly devout wife that FitzRoy began to slowly abandon his previously well-known support of Lyell's geological theories and drift, despite his own previous writings, into a much more literal and evangelical view of the Bible. This regression didn't go unnoticed, and questions remain to this day whether it was purely the influence of his wife, which is unlikely, or perhaps due to broader moral concerns about the civilizational impact of accepting biological evolution. Perhaps it was due to the fact that he had just made another tilt at Parliament, this time successfully gaining a seat as a Tory in 1841, and perhaps wanted to dissociate himself with radical new ideologies. In any case, FitzRoy was riding high, and by all accounts performed competently as an MP. As his term came to an end, a crisis was brewing in the young colony of New Zealand. The indigenous Maori chiefs had just come together and signed a landmark document with the British. Under the Treaty of Waitangi, the Maori ceded sovereignty over the unified nation of New Zealand, but retained full rights over the lands and resources they possessed, giving the Crown an exclusive right to purchase any land they wished to sell. In return, the Maori would have full rights of British citizenship, equality, and protection under the law. The problem was that British entrepreneurs were soon setting up immigration companies that offered land to settlers that hadn't yet been purchased, which caused increasing tension and sporadic violence to break out in the colony. New Zealand at the time had few soldiers or financial resources to keep order, and as the chaos began to spin out of control, its first governor was recalled to London. Missionary groups in New Zealand, concerned about the exploitation of the Maori, had identified FitzRoy as a righteous and competent leader and lobbied for him to be appointed as their new governor. So it wasn't long before Parliament sent him and his now young family to stabilise the crisis. Meanwhile, duped settlers had taken the law into their own hands and began settling in areas not purchased. The Maori retaliated, and a number of settlers were killed in violent exchanges. FitzRoy recognised the grievances of the Maori and consistently ruled disputes in their favour, earning the hatred of white settlers as well as that of corrupt entrepreneurs who had illegally brought them. His review of corporate dealings frequently unearthed illegal land scams, and he consistently nullified and penalised them for it. To appease the landless and cheated settlers, he reformed the law to allow a more expedited transfer of sales directly between parties, but by now the colony was effectively bankrupt, and FitzRoy had no way of regulating or enforcing compliance by settlers who were putting increasing expansionist pressure on the Maori. As the colonists and Maori clashed in open warfare, the entrepreneurs ran a smear campaign against FitzRoy back in London, effectively blaming him for a problem he was given very few resources to contain. FitzRoy was finally recalled to London in 1845, leaving New Zealand in a virtual state of civil war, with the pressure taking such a mental toll on him that he was given time off, and then a desk job as a superintendent of naval dockyards. His health failing, he retired from active service in 1850, but was honoured for his scientific, hydrographic and exploratory work with admission as a Fellow to the Royal Society. Of his list of 13 nominators, Charles Darwin, by now himself a celebrity and long since a Fellow himself, was the last to sign, some say grudgingly, because of their increasingly hostile and divergent views on evolution. After a brief recuperation, Admiral Beaufort, FitzRoy's old benefactor, himself a notable scientist and developer of the Beaufort wind scale, proposed FitzRoy to head a new government department that would compile weather data in an attempt to learn if there were any patterns that could be identified for naval use. We should remember that at this time, the weather was still believed to be entirely unpredictable and random, unrelated to any other physical phenomena. Based on the pioneering ideas of Edmund Halley, Beaufort and FitzRoy had a hunch that air pressure, measured by an instrument called a barometer, had a significant impact on the formation of gales, storms and fog, but they lacked the data to prove it. FitzRoy was now given a staff of just 3 people, and with the recent death of his beloved wife, had been plunged into an even deeper depression. So He characteristically threw himself into his work, developing a series of more accurate barometers and installing them in 15 major ports around the United Kingdom, with readings on temperature, air pressure and humidity being relayed by telegraph to his London office. The data was only meant to be held for naval use, but recognising its critical importance, he used it to draw the first ever weather maps or barometric charts and constructed tables of figures that would indicate the likelihood of unsettled weather. He believed it was so important that he had the information disseminated to fishing communities and lifeboat stations all around the country. This project was the inception of the London Met Office, or the Bureau of Meteorology, an organisation that today employs 1,500 people in the UK alone, and from which FitzRoy published in the newspapers the first ever scientific weather forecast exactly 150 years ago. His tireless work also included authoring what would become a seminal textbook on weather for sailors at the Royal Naval Academy, and it saw him eventually promoted to the rank of Vice Admiral. In 1859, just off the coast of Anglesey, a steamship ignored his forecast storm warnings and soon after its departure from Liverpool was swept onto rocks in a horrific gale that caused the loss of over 450 souls in the greatest ever commercial maritime disaster in Britain up to that point. FitzRoy was so deeply affected by the tragedy that he became relentless in gathering and analysing even more data and having special masts installed in ports across the UK, all at his own expense. When the numbers predicted storms, special warning signal cones would be hoisted up to prevent boats from leaving the port. Fishermen and sailors around the country worshipped him for the many times his forecasts accurately saved their lives. But business owners and shipping magnates would complain that when his predictions, based on such minimal and often late or badly recorded information, proved inaccurate, would cost them money. Nevertheless, London society soon became obsessed with reading his regular prognostications, with Queen Victoria even sending her attendants to enquire the day's weather so that she could dress appropriately. Of course, the curse of every weatherman is the unexpected, and British weather has always proven to be a notorious challenge. FitzRoy had his fair share of failed forecasts that often earned him the ridicule of cartoonists and the criticism of scientists who still viewed meteorology as a pseudoscience akin to astrology. And it wasn't just his weather research that was drawing condescension from academic circles. FitzRoy began to publicly voice his opposition to Darwin's theory of evolution, which had by now gained considerable traction in the Whig-dominated political and social arena. This stance characterised FitzRoy as a fossil of an outdated paradigm, and his refusal to acknowledge the obvious fact of evolution as evidence of his irrelevance. The truth is that FitzRoy, like many other educated Britons, including Darwin, understood very clearly both the elegance of a gradual evolution of animals, but also its seismic societal extrapolation. Darwin himself struggled to reconcile himself with it for decades, and, to his credit, staked his entire future on the hope that others would come around to eventually agreeing with him. FitzRoy, like many others at the time, feared that a society that abruptly abandoned its Christian foundations would crumble into anarchy and barbarism, and so he chose his position out of deep moral conviction and, like Darwin, fearlessly bore the consequences. The majority of the twee gentlemen who famously ridiculed him at a debate in Oxford had never themselves stepped foot outside of Britain, but condemned as ignorant a man who had travelled to the remotest parts of the globe. FitzRoy was a highly astute naval commander who had spent his entire professional life immersed in the natural world, and had studied coastal formations, deserts, jungles, mountains, bizarre animals, and isolated primitive tribes. He collected fossils, he knew his geology extremely well, and made better sketches of the iconic Galapagos finches than even Darwin did. He was certainly no fool, and the fact that he accommodated Darwin's onshore expeditions with so many delayed departures that blew out a 3-year trip into 5 shows his fascination with and understanding of the significance of the task Darwin was working on. Unfortunately for FitzRoy, his intransigence on the issue of evolution now also tainted judgment of his meteorological work, which was decades ahead of its time and was in desperate need of supporters. While gentlemen scientists were revelling in their tumultuous debates over the paternity of primates, FitzRoy was urgently working to save lives and bankrupting himself in the process. Storm clouds were beginning to gather. So why did FitzRoy, having seeded and facilitated Darwin's own ideas, himself then go on to deny biological evolution? While it's unlikely that Darwin himself would have condoned later abuses of his own work, FitzRoy understood at the outset and was horrified at the ramifications of natural selection, which sidelined the divine providence of God and potentially justified the inconsequential exercise of power of the strong over the meek. Within decades, what we now know as social Darwinism would give license to the unrestrained genocide of indigenous people around the world and spawn the eugenics movement that in the 20th century validated the institutionalization and systemic extermination of handicapped and other so-called inferior people. Darwin himself was particularly shocked to see the contrast between the Yagan tribespeople in Tierra del Fuego and the civilized ones they had just repatriated. But when the ship returned to the site some months later, they found their anglicized Fuegans had gone totally native again. The new mission depot was utterly in ruins, with no progress whatsoever being made in the transmission of new skills to the remainder of the community. Despite his strong support of missionary work, it seemed to Darwin as though these people were incapable of adaptation, and the episode was to influence his opinion on primate evolution in a way that FitzRoy found too disturbing to accept. He saw what was coming and was horrified that he had unwittingly played the key role in facilitating it. With this unbearable guilt, academic ridicule over his forecasting, and exhaustion from relentless data gathering, FitzRoy's fragile grip on sanity finally collapsed. One Sunday morning, while he was getting ready for church, he kissed his daughter good morning, then went into his bathroom, locked the door, and cut his own throat with a razor, just as his uncle had done 40 years before. He was only 59 years old. FitzRoy had exhausted his entire personal fortune in setting up data and warning stations all around the country, and his family was now quite destitute. Queen Victoria, one of the few who recognised FitzRoy's many contributions to the nation, gave permanent use of royal apartments to his family, and fundraisers were held across the country to repay the enormous expenditure he had made out of his own pocket for the public good. Many ports still have his early warning system embedded in their harbour masters' quarters. Charles Darwin, greatly saddened at the loss of the tormented giant, whose greatness, despite their later antagonism, he always recognised, said of him, "I never knew in my life so mixed a character, always much to love, and I once loved him sincerely." Mental illness makes for few long-term friends, even today. Robert FitzRoy was an intellectual straddling the cusp of a new age. In many ways, he was clearly ahead of his time, facilitating and even ushering in the future, recognizing that there was still so much urgently to be done. He was acutely aware that rapid social changes were being unleashed. His unwavering support for abolition and indigenous rights showed his commitment to progress and reform. But so far as the implications of a godless and immoral world, subject to what evolution's champion Huxley would later refer to as nature red in tooth and claw, this was a bridge too far, and FitzRoy, the archetypical depressive overthinker, was distraught at being its facilitator. Vice Admiral Robert FitzRoy, by any standards, was a high achiever who was deeply concerned about the future of his fellow man and acted in the way he believed would make the world a safer, more stable, and more secure place. As a troubled boy who grew up virtually alone, whose own mental health was so turbulent and so fragile, perhaps this is not surprising, and despite his stance on evolution, his incredible yet little-known legacy has been preserved in the many landmarks, waterways, mountains, and even species of plants and animals that have been named in his honour, and whose pioneering work scientists continue to rely and build upon to this very day.